But uh, assuming all of y'all have played Battleship at some point in your life. If you haven't, it's simply a game of you have a grid with some ships on a grid, and the opponent cannot see the grid, and you have these bombs that you can throw anywhere on the grid, and you call out where on the grid you're going to throw this bomb. And if it misses, you say miss. If it hits, you say hit. And the reason this is a perfect analogy for understanding how to grow value to users, right, is because when we first start out, we don't really know, right? And there are many pieces to value that we have to learn. It's not ever going to be one thing, right? And so just as when playing Battleship with somebody, the person who wins, right, is the person who learns fastest about how to grow value to users. Similarly with Battleship, right, the person who wins the game, right, is the person who learns fastest about where the other person's ships are, right? So the process is as much about learning what not to do as it is about what to do, right? And the only way you can learn what not to do, right, or the things that don't grow value to users, is to keep trying new things out, right? And you have to do it sort of smartly, right? Because again, and we'll talk about what smartly means, but the person that wins, right, is the person that learns fastest about where the other person's ships are, or in the case of products, the person who learns fastest about what user motivations are and what works for them, and to deliver on those needs, right? So it's a great sort of analogy for that. The other reason it's a great analogy is because it sort of dispels this myth of there's this one magical big growth hack that's going to work and suddenly it'll solve all of your problems, right? Whereas really you have to continually discover pieces of value about your users. And that's analogous to having all of these ships. Is once you find a particular opportunity, or in this case a ship, right, that particular opportunity is only going to last for a certain period of time, and then you're almost going to be back to square one, or in other cases you're going to have to find ways to build on that foundation, right? Which means, again, trying out a lot of things really fast and learning faster than your competition about what works and what doesn't work. Why you should care? Because really because it has a lot to do. In fact, it has pretty much the only thing growth hacking has to do is with growing value to users. And as I just talked about, right, there's a process to testing and learning about what grows value. By definition, it's a process, right? So which means you have to find systematic ways of doing things versus what you likely have read a lot, whether you're on Twitter or LinkedIn, or some latest TechCrunch article that you've read about, oh, these are the 10 headlines you should use on Facebook to get a 20,000% conversion rate, right? Those are tactics, right? And whenever you read an article like that, right, you have to ask the question, right? So why did you do that? Right? And the answer to that why generally is because they've learned something about the motivations or the needs or how their audience behaves, which means they have followed a process to learn more about those things, right? And with how that sort of that North Star for you to understand that everything we do is through the lens of understanding how to grow value to users. Trying to do tactics in isolation is not going to get you growth, right? So you have to focus on a process as a function, right? There is also a cliche, right, when it comes to growth, which is that it's a team sport, and that's absolutely true, right? And it's simple math, right? Because one person is not going to be able to do as much as 10 people doing the exact same thing, right? Or if I was one person in a boat trying to row from one end of the river to the other, and there were 10 people in the next boat, they would get there faster, right? And so if, again, everything we do is look at things through the lens of how do we understand how to grow value to our users, then by definition, all of us have to work together to understand that, right? And that's why it's super important. And if you look at any company that's been successful with growth, it's because they have understood how to align each of their teams to this common goal of how to grow value delivered. And they have understood how to collaborate around all of the activities that then help grow value delivered. Everything boils down to is, right, we can now set some very measurable goals, right, around what is value, how do we quantify value, and that then forces everybody in the team, right, to not just do whatever they feel like or do some fancy new tactic or suddenly use TikTok because everybody want, suddenly B2B is using TikTok, right? But to use the information they have, whether that is information that is quantitative in their analytics or whether that is qualitative through some user research or user reviews, whatever that may be, to then understand, okay, now that we understand X, Y, and Z about our audience, so we understand A, B, and C about why they do a certain thing or why they behave a certain way, that should then inform what we do next versus what is otherwise known as the hippo, right? Or which is an acronym for the highest paid person's opinion. And I'm reasonably sure all of us have dealt with this sort of person, right? So understanding that what we are doing is all about growing value delivered and being able to quantify value delivered then allows everybody to take a data informed approach to how we do what we do, right? And by definition, right, when we say value delivered, we're talking about it from a customer perspective, right? Because the thing that leads to silos and is the sort of enemy of collaboration, right, is that everybody tends to care about their own metrics, right? And with a customer focused metric like, hey, value to customers, right, by definition it improves focus to customers because now that is all we care about and everything we do is in the service of growing value delivered, right? And so this has a really massive impact even on like how we make products, right? Because everything we do in a product then is in the service of growing value delivered, right? So generally product departments are very concerned with releasing new features on time, and all of that is great. You should release new features, but if you don't understand whether or how those new features are going to help grow value delivered, you can release all the features you want. It doesn't really matter, right? On the other end of the spectrum, engineers and engineering teams, at times are very concerned with fixing bugs, and there will always be bugs in product. But if you're not fixing the kind of bugs that are getting most in the way of users experiencing value, then you're not fixing the right kind of bugs, right? Or if customer support is getting a lot of input and a lot of tickets from the customers, that's great. But without an understanding in that department about, okay, which of these tend to be more in the category of users experiencing value versus something that might be an enhancement for the future, as an example, them understanding that can help them make better recommendations to a product department or to a growth department to say, hey, we keep hearing these sorts of things, can we start to test A, B, and C? And again, that helps a feedback loop of making the customer experience so much better, right? So there is a great unifying power in this discipline and in this process, right, which quite frankly isn't spoken about as much, right, but has very real implications on not only your organization's ability to institute this process, but then to carry on using this process through the lens of value delivered. Right? You will just not have the discipline without a process like this, which then impacts across the board every piece of the organization and literally everything that the organization does.